So we've suffered through months of winter, and now we've spent 2 months at home under quarantine, and our efforts are paying off. We're flattening the curve, the weather's getting nicer, and the only thing a lot of us want right now is a little bit of time in the sun. The good news is that health officials are supportive of this.
So please go outside with your family, but stay away, keep your distance.
But can we feel safe walking down the street if there are other people around? What are the rules? And for those of us who don't have a backyard or a patio, how are we supposed to spend time outside when so many parks are closed and there are so many restrictions around the ones that are open? My good friend Manisha Krishnan is on the show today, and we're going to try and tackle all of these questions. She's a reporter for Vice, and she's been covering the enforcement of social distancing rules and closely following what's been happening in parks. I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to Wait, There Is More. Hi.
Hey.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's crazy that we've been doing this for a year, and the first time that we've had you on is during a pandemic.
Yeah, and that I'm here to rant about parks, of all things.
Which we've been doing privately for a while now.
For weeks, yeah.
So I saw you last week, and we were hanging out sort of distantly at Trinity Bellwoods, like sitting really far apart from each other, but I still felt like a criminal, and I was looking over my shoulder the whole time. Did you feel scared?
Did I feel sketchy? Yes. My eyes were like darting around. I was nervous to post a photo of you on Instagram because I didn't want to get shamed for seeing someone outside of my household in public.
I know, and I honestly didn't know if we were allowed to be doing what we were doing. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I went out to the water this weekend, and it felt like there were thousands of people there. Did you have a chance to go out? What was it like? What was it like for you?
Yeah, I've actually taken up riding a bicycle because there's so much less traffic. So I went for a ride through Trinity Bellwoods. I did see a lot of people out, but I felt like they were more or less distancing.
I've been feeling like I've been having a much harder time staying indoors. And the conversations I've been having with friends, it sounds like everyone's kind of on the same page. And I'm wondering, anecdotally, does it seem to you like people are getting more restless and people want to be out more?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think in the early days of this, there were people saying that they had stayed inside and hadn't left their apartment for days or even a full week. And I can just say that when I've done that, when I haven't left my house for a day, I feel really, really bad. And as soon as I sort of step outside, go for a walk, get some fresh air, immediately I feel better. So it just seems like that's one of the few things that makes people feel more normal during this time period.
What exactly is there left to do for this weekend?
Honestly, we're going a little bit batty.
Yeah, it's tough. People want to get outdoors.
Yeah, and there's actually a term now for this kind of waning of discipline that researchers have come up with. This is researchers at the University of Maryland, and they're calling it quarantine fatigue. And this is a real thing. So they looked at cell phone data, and what they found is that people across the US are going outside more than they were at the beginning of the lockdowns, and they're doing it more frequently, they're traveling longer distances, and they're just taking more risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes perfect sense. For people like us who live in Toronto, you know, we've been putting up with crappy weather for months on end. So there's also a sense of anticipation of going out and enjoying the spring and the summer. And I think on top of that, people were just very scared and were under this strict lockdown. But now it seems like more and more health officials are saying it's actually pretty safe to be outside. And so I feel like people are going to get more daring as well with the weather sort of turning.
So I've felt anxious being outside and lingering because a few weeks ago I sat down on a park bench and I was looking at my phone and I heard this noise and I looked up and it was a cop on a horse and he told me to leave the park. And I was really confused because there were other people there. And then last week I saw that people were sitting on benches and cops weren't saying anything to them. And I just don't really know what the rules are at this point. And I feel like a lot of people feel the same way. This is going to become more of an issue as the weather gets warmer. So recently, Bonnie Henry, BC's provincial health officer, said, please go outside. And she actually has been telling people to get fresh air since the beginning. But do you think that the messaging around this has been clear since the beginning and across the board? Like, has it been clear that we should be going outside?
No, it hasn't been clear at all. It's actually been extremely confusing. So in BC, you have Bonnie Henry telling people it's actually okay to go have a picnic with your family and to get outside. And, in BC, they've shut down traffic to Stanley Park, which is a massive park and tourist attraction, to make more space. In Toronto, we've just been told that parks are not a destination and that all amenities are off limits. Now, a lot of people don't even realize that a park bench counts as an amenity, but it does. And then on top of that, there's a lot of confusion around whether you can sort of linger and hang out on the grass or not. I actually tried to get an answer from the City of Toronto on that, and they pretty much refused to answer it. All they would say is parks are not considered a destination.
We want to give them an opportunity to see the cherry blossoms, to keep moving, but not for it to be a destination and not to congregate.
And then on top of that, you have, other rules in different municipalities. For example, the town of Aurora in Ontario, if you go into a park, you can only walk on the walkways. So it's illegal to linger or be on the grass.
Yeah. So it's confusing to tell people to go outside and then close all these public outdoor spaces and put all these different restrictions in place. It makes people think that going outside is a bad idea. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think the stay home message has really sort of taken off. And as a consequence of that, you actually have people who feel very frustrated when they even see their neighbors and friends outside. And they're essentially shaming people.
I see what goes on in that park, and people aren't being diligent.
We're seeing a lot of photos being posted of parks and people just sort of seemingly resentful that other people are enjoying the outdoors, when that in and of itself isn't a bad thing as long as people are distancing.
And so there are experts now urging local governments to lift the restrictions on parks, and this message, I think, is coming out a little bit more strongly now that we know a little bit more about how the virus spreads. And can you talk a bit about what the science says about how easy it is to catch COVID-19 when you're outside?
Yeah, so I think BC's health officer, Bonnie Henry, summed it up best when she said the risk is negligible of you catching COVID-19 from walking past someone, even if they're sneezing or coughing. Even if you are within the 2-meter sort of distance, it's pretty much negligible if you're outside.
I mean, we always say never in medicine, but, the risk would be infinitesimally small. If somebody runs by you, somebody walks by you, even if they were within 6 feet.
And all the data that we have so far suggests that it's really the closed spaces, such as long-term care homes and people's homes and meat factories, that we have to be concerned about. There's really not a lot that suggests that there's a ton of transmission happening from hanging out in parks.
Yeah, and there's an infectious disease specialist named Dr. Stan Houston at the University of Alberta. And another thing that he said was that air currents and sunlight and just the fact that there's so much air to dilute the virus in an outdoor setting all mean that it's much harder for a virus to transmit outside. And in general, almost nothing transmits efficiently outdoors. So let's talk about the other side of this, which is, what are the mental health costs of not going outside and the benefits of being outdoors? What do we know about that?
I mean, what we know is that being outside is a stress reliever. This is a time where people are already very anxious. And keep in mind that a lot of people are crammed into apartments, sometimes with larger families. Some of those family situations may also not be the best. So going outside, it's a form of self-care for a lot of people. It helps sort of reduce that anxiety. It also gives you physical activity, which is known to have an impact on your mood.
Psychologist Pierre Faubert says all this indoor time is unnatural. we need people. We need others. We need to feel that we belong to a community.
You've written a lot about the enforcement of social distancing rules in parks. And in a lot of these cases, people just seem confused about what the rules are. Can you tell us a bit about some of the different rules across the country and why people have been surprised when they've gotten ticketed?
Sure. So as I just mentioned, in Toronto, they banned all park amenities. And so there were people who didn't realize that, for example, a bench was considered an amenity. There was a guy that I interviewed, a criminal lawyer. He didn't realize that the pull-up bar in a park, completely empty, was an amenity. So he got fined $880. In Aurora, which I mentioned earlier, I talked to a mother who went out with her 6-month-old baby and her dog, and she was on a walkway and she saw people coming towards her. So she stepped under a gazebo to allow them to pass. And a bylaw officer came up to her and he ticketed her $880 because he said she had been standing around for too long. He said he had timed her and that she'd been standing for over 2 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, she had no idea that that was a rule, and I don't actually think it is a rule. So I think there's another issue here with bylaw officers sort of interpreting these new bylaws, however they want, and in some cases clearly not using discretion.
Right.
A family from Oakville is facing a big fine for what they thought was just an innocent family outing.
They wanted to go rollerblading. We just got new rollerblades for one of them.
Despite living under the same roof, they've been accused of violating physical distancing rules.
I kind of looked around. There was nobody near us. The whole parking lot was completely empty. And I just said, well, who are we hurting?
There have been a lot of complaints that some of the enforcement of rules within parks has been really heavy-handed.
The laws on their face are not so much the problem, although some of them are overbroad and vague. But the main problem is with their enforcement.
We've even seen some policy reversals and politicians admitting that the enforcement's been overzealous, right?
Yeah, I mean, so this mom story, it actually made it all the way up to Doug Ford in one of his press conferences. A journalist asked him about it, and he said that he thought it was probably not the best use of judgment. In Ottawa, we had a public health official say that you shouldn't be talking to your neighbors in your driveway or in your yard because it could turn into a block party. And then the next day, another public health official said, actually, it's fine to do that.
Yeah.
So there's another issue here where the messaging is just a bit patronizing, to be honest. Just because I'm saying hi to my neighbor in my front yard, it doesn't mean that we're going to throw a rager 2 minutes later. People are adults and they have self-control.
Yeah. Okay, and there are also different things happening with national, provincial, and municipal parks, which adds to the confusion. Can you break down those different rules for us?
Yes. So national parks are closed until at least May 31st. Provincial parks vary. So in Alberta and Manitoba, they're open with certain rules. In BC and Ontario, for example, they're closed, basically because they're saying they don't want people to be traveling that far. They don't want it to be a destination for people. And then municipalities have their own regulations that vary from city to city. So in Toronto, you're not allowed to use any park amenities, and you can't be within 2 meters of anyone who's outside your household at a park. So amenities would include a playground or anything like a basketball court or a tennis court. Places where people would gather and play sports are off limits. They're really discouraging any type of lingering or loitering. They're saying you can go to get a walk and get some exercise in, but keep it moving. So it's just kind of all over the place. Dog parks are all pretty much closed. I talked to a few people in Ottawa who said even walking their dogs on leash, they're getting hassled constantly by bylaw officers telling them to sort of hurry up. So there seems to be an anti-lingering and anti-loitering situation happening in Ontario, at least.
Yeah. And this is happening even when people are just standing on their own. And what is the rationale behind that? What was the rationale for closing parks in the first place, if these are big spaces where people can theoretically physically distance and just be on their own?
So I think what happened was Basically, people are just getting used to the idea of physical distancing. And there are photos that were going viral of people still sort of congregating in parks. So in Vancouver, there was photos of the beaches being sort of busy. And in Toronto, I think the waterfront. And I feel like, you know, the mayor and the cities were probably getting inundated with calls. And as such, John Tory, for example, you know, issued a letter to police saying he wants stronger enforcement.
In a letter to Toronto's police chief, Tory appealed to stricter policing in public spaces. Tory says he wants to see more tickets issued for those who do not comply. And Toronto's police chief responded saying police are no longer giving warnings.
You know, I think that may have been a bit premature. And I certainly think that now we're around 2 months in, people seem to have a much better understanding. I really think that the restrictions need to ease up and that enforcement should really be a last resort. So basically, I feel like cities may have sort of jumped the gun by calling for such heavy-handed enforcement really quite early on. People still didn't totally get the message yet.
Yeah. And this has been especially hard for people who are homeless, right? We've talked on this show about how it's been especially difficult for people who don't have a home to practice social distancing. And the physical distancing rules have kind of narrowed the number of spaces that these people can go to. So libraries are closed and coffee shops are closed and there are less outdoor spaces, and then you have harsh enforcement on top of that. Can you tell me a bit about how this has impacted the homeless population?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, shelters are obviously a risk because it's very hard to distance in them. A lot of shelters have closed down. You just mentioned these sort of de facto community centers like libraries and coffee shops. You know, and then on top of that, you have homeless people being ticketed. I know in Montreal, there was sort of a bunch of people being ticketed at a subway station.
This ticket given to a homeless man for an illegal gathering, along with its fines, amounts to $1,546.
In New York City, police are undertaking this massive operation where they're going to try to remove all the homeless people from subway stations and from subways. So there's also a real sort of dehumanizing factor to all this. And when you think that on top of all that, people are being fined hundreds of dollars that they clearly are not going to be able to pay, it just doesn't make any sense as a policy.
We'll be right back. So what do you think are the risks of this kind of enforcement, which a lot of people have called overzealous, and keeping these outdoor spaces closed as the weather gets warmer, as people are getting more restless?
Honestly, I think one of the biggest risks is just people getting fed up and feeling more and more rebellious, because if they're being told to follow these rules that, you know, in a lot of cases don't really make sense, and they've already been on this strict lockdown for however long, you know, people are just going to start doing what they want to do, and they're going to lose that goodwill and that trust that they have in public officials. You know, abstinence only has never really been effective for anything, and I don't think it'll be any different in this situation. I think we have to start opening things up and being a bit more creative and, you know, not resorting to this tough law enforcement means of getting people to fall in line.
Yeah. And when you say more creative, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in other cities, like, for example, in Montreal, they are shutting down large streets to make them pedestrian only. And, you know, like I said, in Vancouver, they've sort of shut down traffic along some of the beaches and the bigger parks. In Berlin, where they already have massive bike lanes, they've made those even bigger. In Toronto, so far, I don't know, walking around, I've seen some sort of extended sidewalk type things, but not really super extended. We've shut down High Park in Toronto. It's a massive park. It's a 400-acre park.
You can see at this hour, police officers are here stopping anybody from entering. These barriers also stopping people from entering. As I'm standing here, I'm completely fine. But as soon as I have 2 feet on this side of the barrier, it's a $1,000 fine.
It's shut down because of the cherry blossoms, which are a very small part of that park. So why not, instead of shutting it down, why not just have enforcement around that area? You know, another option that I heard about is having hours for different demographics to use certain parks, like seniors in the morning and, you know what I mean, families during the afternoon, that type of thing. Having greeters at the park. I mean, I would hate this job, but basically greeting people and outlining the rules.
Yeah.
Having one-way paths is another idea. We're kind of seeing that in some grocery stores. So this is going to be something that we're going to be grappling with long term. We do need to think of actual solutions that don't involve just fining people.
Yeah. And until we find those, what advice would you give people when it comes to getting fresh air? How do we navigate this right now?
I would say definitely go outside, you know, go for walks, use the parks. Just be smart about it. Look up your municipality's guidelines. And if you do get stopped by someone, you can ask them questions. You can ask them why you're being stopped, what specific bylaw it is that you're supposedly violating. You can let them know that you're going to record them and you can record the interaction. And you have more than 2 weeks to sort of dispute the fine. So just sort of knowing your rights is also an important part of this. But also, try not to judge other people. I think that's happening a lot right now, where we're all sort of shaming and judging in part because we feel anxious. If someone's outside, if they're with a few people, like, you don't know their situation. You don't know why they're outside. You don't know if they're roommates and they are from the same household. So, you know, avoid calling that snitch line and avoid sort of shaming other people if you can.
Thanks, Manny. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So Manisha and I talked this morning, and since then, Toronto Mayor John Tory has announced that the city is going to open streets to make more room for pedestrians and cyclists. The initial target is 50 kilometers of quiet streets, and it's going to happen on a trial basis. And another quick update before we go. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, was asked today to respond to Ontario Premier Doug Ford's calls for a national strategy on contact tracing. She didn't really get into specifics, but she said that the federal government is exploring different options. So if you want to learn more about contact tracing, check out our episode from yesterday called How Contact Tracing Could Help Reopen Canada. And that's all for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.